Alright guys, welcome to part 2 of Gugwes Don't Exist. Or do they? In part 1 we discussed a ton of interesting information, and part 2 here is going to be no different, but I do ask that if you have not seen the first part of this video, that you please stop right here and you go watch it. It will make everything in this part make sense. I will leave a link down below. I'll also try and see if I can get a little banner to pop out here, and you can click the link there. If you have not watched it, please do, and then you can come back over here and finish watching. And this part will make everything that you watched in part 1 make sense. But conversely, if you don't watch part 1, part 2 here will be pretty empty. So they feed into each other. I wasn't initially intending to have a part 1 and part 2, but I feel like it is important for the sake of the viewer to kind of break it up a little bit, make the video a little bit shorter. You can watch it in pieces now instead of one big video. So hope you guys enjoy. Remember to please like, share, and subscribe. To share the video, please scroll down. You will see a share icon. If you click on that, you can copy the link, share it wherever you feel it's appropriate, or to whomever you think would enjoy it. And again, like and subscribe. If you subscribe, please click the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I come out with a new video. And please feel free, once you're done watching, again, part 1 and now part 2 all the way through, please feel free to comment your thoughts. All right, let's dive right in. Here we go. This is a common argument against Sasquatch, and one I've heard and discussed with others numerous times. There are explanations that are used to attempt to explain why they aren't found, and some are quite logical. My take is that the skull of a Sasquatch is the same size as a large human male. If you look at individuals like Andre the Giant and Angus McGaskill, their heads were quite large, and it has been noted that heights of 6 foot and over were quite common among Native American males. Add to it a skull that is characteristically human, and any bones or teeth that are found, unless it is a truly large individual, would be disregarded as human. There are numerous reports that reported a small, for body size, skull on a large body, which corresponds well with the theory. And since the materials for building and maintaining a brain are difficult to provide, as discussed in Jeremy De Silva's book, First Steps, once again, quote, your brain is only 2% of your body weight, but it uses 20% of the energy you take in. That means every 5th breath you draw and every 5th bite of food you eat is earmarked for the hungry cells of the brain. So once you have achieved a healthy brain size, there's no need to develop it further, is there? In short, no, there isn't. Now, there is far more to that theory, and I am not even close to being able to make anything video-related about that theory, but I am working on it. Doubtless, it's safe to say a baboon head is very different, especially such a large baboon head. A baboon head is relatively small, but one the size of a wolf or bear is very big and doesn't seem like something anyone would have missed for such a long time. A bear head is slightly different, after all. They are a native species, but any morphological differences would probably be noticed by hunters or any outdoorsman who knows bears well, especially if they are primarily meat-eaters. The skull would likely be similar to that of the polar bears. According to the Great Bear Almanac by Gary Brown, quote, bear's teeth, combined with paws and claws, are its first-line tools for defense in obtaining food. The teeth are large, and though originally carnivorous, are adapted to an omnivorous diet of both meat and plant materials. The major difference between carnivore and omnivore dentition are the molars, which in bears are broad and flat. Dentition, the size, shape, and use of the teeth and jaw muscles, influence the size and shape of a bear's head. Bears have 42 teeth, except the sloth bear, which has only 40. Permanent teeth are normally in place by the time a bear is approximately 2.5 years old. For each species, the characteristics of the 4 kinds of teeth, incisors, canines, premolars, and molars, vary depending on diet and habitat. Polar bears have canines that are larger and longer than other bears, and molars that are smaller than those of land bears. The molars are more for biting than grinding. Brown bears' teeth are comprised of flat and broad crowns on molars, premolars, and molars for grinding. Here's a comparison of the bear skulls, and you'll see that polar bears have a different skull shape than grizzlies. According to a scientific article entitled Biomechanical Consequences of Rapid Evolution in the Polar Bear's Lineage, published November 5, 2010, quote, The polar bear is the only living ursid with a fully carnivorous diet. Despite a number of well-documented craniodental adaptations for a diet of seal flesh and blubber, molecular and paleontological data indicate that this morphologically distinct species evolved less than 1 million years ago from the omnivorous brown bear. To better understand the evolution of this dietary specialization, we used phylogenetic tests to estimate the rate of morphological specialization in polar bears. We then used finite element analysis, FEA, to compare the limits of feeding performance in the polar bear's skull to that of the phylogenetically and geographically close brown bear. Results indicate that extremely rapid evolution of semi-aquatic adaptations and dietary specialization in the polar bear lineage produced a cranial morphology that is weaker than that of brown bears and less suited to processing tough omnivorous or herbivorous diets. The polar bear, Ursus maritimus, is unique among living ursids as the only member of the family with an exclusively carnivorous diet. As a result of this specialized diet, has evolved a series of craniodental adaptations that allow it to efficiently process a diet of seal flesh and blubber. For example, polar bears exhibit reduced surface area of the grinding molar teeth, a feature normally pronounced in more omnivorous ursids, and a low, slender skull. Despite possessing such distinctive phenotypic features, molecular and paleontological data unequivocally indicate that the carnivorous polar bear evolved relatively recently, approximately 150 to 700,000 years ago, from coastal populations of the more generalized and omnivorous brown bear, Ursus arctos. In this study, we take a combined evolutionary and biomechanical approach to examine the evolution of adaptations to carnivory in the polar bear cranium. Stress distributions and magnitudes differed between the two models for all bites. For each biting scenario, the polar bear skull exhibited more widely varying stresses and higher peak stresses than for the brown bear. Differences between the two species were most marked for bites made with the molars, where peak stresses in the polar bear were up to 408% those of the brown bear. Similarly, strain energy values were higher in the polar bear cranium than for the brown bear for all bites, indicating that the polar bear skull undergoes more deformation in producing similar bite forces. Again, differences between the polar bear and brown bear crania were most pronounced for bites made with the post-canine dentition, the main site for processing of ingested food. Our model results are unvalidated by in vivo data and should be treated as estimates only. However, based on our findings, it appears that although the two species are similar in cranial size and have similar muscle leverage potential, the polar bear skull is a weaker, less work-efficient structure and does not appear well-suited to dealing with large, masticatory loads. Now, it should be noted that the bone density of polar bears has gone down within the last 100 years. It used to be quite a bit higher, meaning some of these points about a weaker frame should be taken with a grain of salt. On paper it means a lot, but the design works well, and that point should not be lost. But to sum the article up, polar bears have unique dentition allowing for a purely carnivorous diet, unlike brown bears, grizzly bears, or black bears. Maybe they are like a grizzly in head shape, but their dentition adapted for more shearing? Gugwes, that is. Or they could be more like the giant short-faced bear. The giant short-faced bear's skull and shearing type of teeth indicate a highly carnivorous way of life. Its eye sockets are set wide apart and face forward, giving it excellent vision. Its short, broad snout had a huge nasal passage, which probably means it had a keen sense of smell and could inhale great volumes of oxygen while pursuing prey. The large width of the jaws in relation to their shortness, plus the huge insertions for biting muscles, gave this bear a vice-like killing bite and the ability to crush bones and obtain marrow. Tests of bone samples show a very high ratio of nitrogen-15 to nitrogen-14, a nitrogen signature that indicates a true carnivore. Everything considered, paleobiologists conclude that the giant short-faced bear ate only meat. No one has said it looked like a polar bear, and there are few sightings indicating the appearance being like that of a short-faced bear. Most of the bear appearance sightings just say, a bear. And most people think of grizzlies when the word bear comes up. I know this from a multitude of individuals who will click on my videos discussing bear protection, and they'll assume that grizzlies are what I'm talking about. I bring up points on both this channel and Jep's Outdoor Adventures which many don't think I'll discuss. It always hurts when people assume, make a dumb comment, and leave. But doubtless, the mighty American classic, the grizzly, is what 90% of people go to in my experience. So I will have to assume that this is what everyone is talking about, quite possibly including the native beliefs. This means one of these must be true. A. They don't exist. B. They are very different than what people have reported. C. There are misidentified bears, maybe a small number of short-faced bears still in existence. Or D. They are not carnivorous. Either or any way, a long-held belief is wrong, and the idea that such bones could go unnoticed is difficult to wrestle with. Another reason I am skeptical towards the supposed existence of Gugwes is the lack of DNA. Specifically, eDNA. An upright bear that is physically similar to either a polar bear or short-faced bear should show up in eDNA tests, but nothing. A baboon-like creature should show up as well, but nothing. eDNA is the DNA captured from the environment, usually a sample of water from a predominant water source, like a large creek, but it can also include soil samples. If an animal drank from a water source, peed in it, or died in that water, then its DNA will be in that water. Or in the case of soil, if it pooped on the section you test, or urinated on it, bled on it, or died years ago, and decomposed into that soil, its DNA should be present and will show it was there at some point in time. Polar bears or something similar in the lower portions of Canada and North America as a whole, as well as something similar to baboons or mandrills across the entire North American continent, should not show up naturally, but would show up in the DNA test and would raise eyebrows. It would be DNA that could then be scrutinized and documented. You could then take that DNA and figure out what it's related to and where it would sit on a phylogenetic tree. It could be named and recorded. That has not happened yet. Now, what explanations can we come up with to explain away the eDNA, or rather the lack of? Well, the majority of eDNA is done by the government, namely the Fish and Wildlife type divisions. The government doesn't have a great track record when it comes to telling the truth, so it takes little imagination to understand why it wouldn't come out publicly. And mainstream media has shown itself to be a bit of a mouthpiece for big business and the government on past occasions, and we also know how they feel about Sasquatch, having been ridiculers of the topic on past occasions. Another point to mention is that if you don't take a water sample at the right time, the dead body may have been dragged out, or there may be no more urine or feces, as it may have flowed by some time ago. Giant short-faced bears lived on this continent for a long time, so any eDNA from one could be explained away as a short-faced bear having died there, or maybe, as far as the water tests go, may have been exposed by the flow of water, and its assumed bones are present upstream. If a stream went underground and flowed through rock like granite or sandstone at some point, it may have been filtered out. At the end of the day, it really comes down to the timing, if you tested the water while the biological material was flowing through or not. As far as the government, there's enough opportunity for people to become whistleblowers where I feel like we would have heard something, and not something shoddy either. A few stories have arisen about Dogman or Sasquatch, but there's no photographic evidence or anything verifiable, which should come forward if genuine, I'd think. Is it possible that they are just incredibly rare? I suppose. Here's an excerpt from the video I made entitled How Aggressive Are Sasquatch, where I discuss a couple reasons that might be. If Bigfoot is real, then they are likely to be low in number, so there would logically be a need for a breeding population as most species try to avoid inbreeding, so that would be a natural response. Especially if they are, again, somewhat human like many purport. If so, they may struggle to reproduce just like some humans do, or rather struggle to give birth safely. Women today still have difficulty, even with medical advancements, with having safe pregnancies and keeping mother and child safe during the birthing process. To quote the National Library of Medicine, "For every minute of every day of every year, year in and year out, somewhere in the world a woman dies of complications arising from pregnancy or childbirth. More than 600,000 women die needlessly each year. The majority of these mothers die without skilled care, perhaps lying on a dirt-ridden floor, attended only by the women of their families or untrained birth attendants using traditional harmful practices. They die in pain, in fear, and in vain. Babies suffer too. Maternal mortality and morbidity have a direct impact on the health and well-being of the newborn. Around 98% of the nearly 6 million stillbirths or deaths of babies in the first week of life occur in developing countries. Most will die because of maternal complications, a third being due to intrapartum complications leading to birth asphyxia. Babies who survive their mother's death seldom reach their first birthday, and millions of older, motherless children face uncertain futures. It's very sad, and all of this shows how human birthing is much more difficult and painful than that of large apes. According to SciTech Daily, this was long believed to be due to humans' bigger brains and the limited dimensions of the mother's pelvis. Researchers at the University of Zurich have now shown using 3D simulations that birthing was likewise a highly complicated procedure in early hominin species that gave birth to relatively small brain newborns, with significant consequences for their cognitive development. The fetus normally navigates a narrow, convoluted birth canal by bending and turning its head at different phases during human delivery. This complicated procedure has a significant risk of birth complications, which may range from extended labor to stillbirth or maternal death. These issues were long thought to be the outcome of a conflict between humans adjusting to upright walking and our larger brains. A research group led by Martin Hassler from the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich and a team headed up by Pierre Frémondier from Aix-Marseille University have now found that Australopithecines, who lived about 4 to 2 million years ago, had a complex birth pattern compared to great apes. Because Australopithecines, such as Lucy, had relatively small brain sizes but already displayed morphological adaptations to bipedalism, they are ideal to investigate the effects of these two conflicting evolutionary forces, Hassler says. The researchers used three-dimensional computer simulations to develop their findings. Since no fossils of newborn Australopithecines are known to exist, they simulated the birth process using different fetal head sizes to take into account the possible range of estimates. Every species has a typical ratio between the brain sizes of its newborns and adults. Based on the ratio of non-human primates and the average brain size of an adult Australopithecus, the researchers calculated a mean neonatal brain size of 180 grams. This would correspond to a size of 110 grams in humans. For their 3D simulations, the researchers also took into account the increased pelvic joint mobility during pregnancy and determined a realistic soft tissue thickness. They found that only the 110-gram fetal head sizes passed through the pelvic inlet and midplane without difficulty, unlike the 180-gram and 145-gram sizes. This means that Australopithecus newborns were neurologically immature and dependent on help, similar to human babies today, Hassler explains. The findings indicate that Australopithecines are likely to have practiced a form of cooperative breeding even before the genus Homo appeared. Compared to great apes, the brains develop for longer outside the uterus, enabling infants to learn from other members of the group. This prolonged period of learning is generally considered crucial for the cognitive and cultural development of humans, Hassler says. Bigfoot are upright like us, and so likely experience the same birthing issues as humans do, and the young are very vulnerable at a young age, more vulnerable to a number of issues, complications, diseases, or injury of any sort than a young ape. That would help explain their relatively low numbers, and if inbreeding is an issue, it could help explain the three-toed prints and such that have been found before. So maybe they're just incredibly rare. They can't give birth easily, and maybe their breeding population is low. If they live in remote environments and are rare, maybe that's why there are no bones that have been found. And maybe their young are what people have reported to be devil monkeys, and they simply grow up to be larger creatures. Is it possible that Gugwes are a military experiment? Well, this doesn't explain the native beliefs, but they aren't always even talking about a creature, but rather a giant woman anyway. And if they are talking about a creature, it's not always on land. So, setting them aside, it's possible, I suppose. I know nothing about genetics, but according to Science.org's article, entitled Lab-Grown Embryos Mix Human and Monkey Cells for the First Time, written April 15th, 2021 by Mitch Leslie, quote, "By slipping human stem cells into the embryos of other animals, we might someday grow new organs for people with faltering hearts or kidneys. In a step toward that goal, researchers have created the first embryos with a mixture of human and monkey cells. These chimeras could help scientists hone techniques for growing human tissue in species better suited for transplants, such as pigs." The paper is a landmark in the stem cell and interspecies chimera fields, says stem cell biologist Alejandro de Los Angeles of Yale University. The findings hint at mechanisms by which cells of one species can adjust to survive in the embryo of another, adds Daniel Gary, a stem cell biologist at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. In 2017, researchers reported growing pancreases from mouse stem cells inserted into rat embryos. Transplanting the organs into mice with diabetes eliminated the disease, but cells from more distantly related species, such as pigs and humans, haven't gotten along as well. That same year, developmental biologist Juan Carlos Izpaisua Belmonte of the Salk Institute for Biological Studies and colleagues reported injecting human stem cells into pig embryos. After the embryos had developed in surrogate mother pigs for 3 to 4 weeks, only about 1 in 100,000 of their cells were human. The pig study used human skin cells that had been reprogrammed into stem cells, but so-called extended pluripotent stem, EPS, cells made by exposing stem cells to a certain molecular cocktail can spawn a greater variety of tissues. In the new study, Izpaisua Belmonte, reproductive biologist Waizhi Ji, I do not know how to say these names, of Kunming University of Science and Technology, and colleagues tested these more capable cells in a closer human relative, cynomolgus monkeys. They inserted 25 human EPS cells into each of 132 monkey embryos and reared the chimeras in culture dishes for up to 20 days. The team reports today in Cell that the human cells showed staying power. After 13 days, they were still present in about 1/3 of the chimeras. The human cells seemed to integrate with the monkey cells and had begun to specialize in the cell types that would develop into different organs. By analyzing gene activity, the researchers identified molecular pathways that were switched on or turned up in the chimeras, possibly promoting integration between human and monkey cells. Izpaisua Belmonte says manipulating some of those pathways may help human cells survive in embryos of species, quote, more appropriate for regenerative medicine, end quote. Still, the human and monkey cells didn't quite mesh, notes stem cell biologist Andrew Crane. The human cells often stuck together, making him wonder whether there's, quote, another barrier that we aren't seeing, end quote, that could prevent human cells from thriving if the embryos were to develop further. In the United States, federal funding cannot be used to create certain types of chimeras, including early non-human primate embryos containing human stem cells. The new study was performed in China, and funded by Chinese government sources, a Spanish university, and a U.S. foundation. Bioethicist Karen Maschke of the Hastings Center in New York says she is satisfied that the work, which passed layers of institutional review and drew on advice from 2 independent bioethicists, was performed responsibly. Human-monkey chimeras do raise a worry, addressed in a report released last week by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, that human nerve cells might enter animals' brains and alter their mental capabilities. But that concern is moot for the chimeras in this study because they don't have a nervous system. They can't experience pain and aren't conscious, says bioethicist Katrien de Volder of the University of Oxford. If the human-monkey chimeras were allowed to develop further, she says, that would be a very different story. Is it just me, or does it sound like she's hinting that it could survive? Have they had the technology to do this back in the 80s or 90s and have made numerous versions of Frankenstein's monster? I do not know. In an episode of UFO Hunters, Season 2, Episode 15, there was a cattle mutilization where the cow and a severely disformed fetus were killed. It was investigated by a state trooper, and he was interviewed in this excerpt of the show.
We're on our way for a meeting with Gabe Valdez, a retired New Mexico State police officer. Gabe investigated cattle mutilations 20 years ago, in which cattle, seemingly healthy, are killed, and then the soft tissue is excised from their bodies. We hope he'll share whatever he learned with us.
In my profession, you have to focus on physical evidence. Gas masks, monitoring instruments, radar shaft, and helicopter activity. We're taking pictures of a lot of helicopter activity in the area. These were just taken 10 days ago. We could tell where the aircraft came to. They didn't do the whole process. This is what we found inside the fetus of the mutilated cow.
But it was not a cow fetus.
Some part of it was, and the other wasn't.
bizarre.
And was this open when you found it?
Yeah, it was open. You really had to retrieve them back in order to see them.
So there are eyes underneath that fur skin going on.
Look at the ear.
That's an ear?
Yeah, that's the ear. It's an ear of the human.
What happened to the fetus?
We took it and had it analyzed. It was very confusing to the veterinarians.
Did the vet identify anything as human in that fetus?
Yeah, I think he could tell the eyes were.
Now, this idea would explain why any DNA that should be there doesn't exist, and why they are few and far between. It would also explain why the sightings only started up in recent years. Unfortunately, I have no expertise in genetics, and so cannot provide much information to this possibility. Another option is that they are demonic, hence why there is no concrete evidence and why they instill such fear and terror into the hearts of those who see it, and why each one looks different. At this point, it's all conjecture. My problem is that the information about their appearance is very conflicting, and unlike Sasquatch, there is no majority of data that seems realistic. It's all over the place here. Some are bears, some are baboons. Neither one really looks alike to me. I will say, though, that the one type that is reported most frequently are of a baboon-like creature, so maybe those are the only ones to consider viable. There's also a problem with them being carnivorous because a grizzly bear snout implies herbivore, unless it looks more like a polar bear's or giant short-faced bear's. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, no one reports the appearance being specifically like a polar bear's, and few like a giant short-faced bear's, which it would need to look like if it is carnivorous. It's also worth noting that there are no reports that I could find of them eating plants, which would make sense if they are like a baboon or a grizzly. Now, I do not see upright bears being conflated with a bipedal primate by anyone other than scared people or inexperienced individuals. It does hold some promise, as people have shot moose here in Idaho thinking that they were elk, because they were inexperienced and didn't know the differences between either one, even though there are quite a few. So that is a possibility, but the idea that an experienced outdoorsman, or really anyone familiar with the local wildlife, could confuse one for the other is not possible for all sightings in my eyes. It's possible some sightings were because someone saw a bear, but was under the effect of a hallucinogen like black mold, as such a hallucinogen only accentuates what is there, and could cause you to see incorrect details. But honestly, that doesn't fully explain anything in my eyes. And if most or all sightings are of a small number of giant short-faced bears, then why do they walk around on their hind legs if they are so well adapted to being quadrupedal? They simply cannot be bears if their sightings are to be believed. Bears do not have hands, and they cannot grasp, rip, or carry things with their paws easily, if at all. Is it possible people are really just seeing your average Bigfoot? Here's a drawing I made, and I based the mouth-jaw portion off of a Neanderthal. It does have a bit of a muzzle, or a Homer Simpson, if you will. I can see someone traumatized, misremembering details that stood out more prominently for being different than they really were. Fear and adrenaline cause your memory to be more fragmented, and you can go in and change details subconsciously, especially years after the fact. It's possible. To continue, if it is a baboon-like species that adapted to a cold environment and became carnivorous, its dentition likely changed. But why is it they have such a long muzzle if they are bipedal? If the muzzle is shorter than your normal baboons, is that why some say bear or Rottweiler? Do people only say baboon because it has a vague resemblance to them and is the closest thing to what they saw, rather than outright similarities? Are they only bipedal when they encounter humans or have to carry something? Maybe they stand on their hind legs and puff up their chest to seem as large as possible, a survival technique they learned dealing with large cats that would prey upon them. There are just too many questions, and too many conflicting statements, and too little answers. All of it just does not make sense to me. I'm highly skeptical that they exist, but I suppose it's possible. But I want to hear what you think. Please comment down below, and please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, as I brought out earlier. Thank you all very much for hearing me out, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.